Little is known to Muslims about Balay al-Rumi, to Hispano-Visigoths about Pelagius, or to us about Don Pelayo, a man who, a few years after the Muslim invasion of Hispania, along with another 300 more supporters, we do not know if a battle or a skirmish of consequences, then unimaginable confrontation that allowed the creation of the most humble of the kingdom of Asturias, the first focus of Christian resistance organized against the Muslim invasion of Hispania, a rebellion that, as the historian Hamed Muhammad al-Makari, was despised by the Arabs, which meant the beginning of what until the end of the 18th century was called Restoration, and that today we know as Reconquest. The figure of Pelayo and that of his loyalty moves between history and legend, between the fable and the real, between tradition and the divine, and of course among the interests of those who wrote about his events more than 100 years after these occurred to show us who he was and what he did. Pelayo historians, in addition to basing themselves on archaeological discoveries and oral tradition, have had to interpret and categorize especially 2 Christian chronicles and at least 1 Muslim. The main written sources are the Albeldan Chronicle, made in the year 881, and the Chronicles of Alfonso III of Asturias, in its 2 versions, Rotense and Sebastianense, written around the year 900 among the Muslims, highlights the history of the kings of Al-Andalus, written in the second half of the 10th century by Isa ibn Hamad al-Razi. Of all of them, a large part of the researchers consider the Albeldan's Chronicle within what fits the most reliable of all. On the one hand, the Alfonso Chronicles are written in religious key in order to first link the Asturian monarchy with the Visigothic Christian and chanted by God, based on the medieval principle of non est potestas nic audio. That is, there is no legitimate authority that does not come from God. On the other hand, the Muslim tries to discredit everything that can be done by Pelayo. The place and date of birth of our protagonist is unknown. The tradition assures that it was in the Cantabrian town of Coscala. Its origin is not known either. Most of the scholars deduce from its Hispano-Visigothic root more than only the Cantabrian Astur, so expressed in the Sebastian Chronicle. It can be suspected that his father Favela was a noble god and Dux Asturiensis. There are those who speculate that Pelayo as a child was sent to the court of Toledo, where over time he became a spade of Batiza, a high military position of the court, and later also that of Don Rodrigo, his father, as expressed in the Albense Chronicle, died violently in the Galician town of Tai, and Pelayo was expelled from Toledo by Batiza, taking refuge in the remote province of Astura, from where he could be original, remaining in it until the Muslims arrived. Astura then was a province of small political and economic importance in relation to the rich Romanized and urbanized villages of the Ebro, or the Guadalquivir, cut in 2 by the crests of Europe. Asturico Augusta, today Astorga, was the most important city between the mountains and the sea. Only Gijón was arriving at what could be considered a city. The rest were a series of wasted villages. Its inhabitants had been the last to be Romanized in the Iberian Peninsula, with the reputation of rebels. Estrabon spoke of them that they preferred death to slavery. Flavio Aurelio called them specialist warriors in guerrilla warfare and good horsemen. Bomba in 680 was able to attest to the loyalty with which the Cantabrians Asturians preserved their traditions and autonomy. Perhaps that is the reason why they did not pay taxes to the Romans or to the Visigoths. A legend tells that Pelayo, already settled in Asturias, decided to journey to the Holy Land. On his return he became the swordsman of his relative Don Rodrigo. As the chronicler Rotense assures, it is to be supposed, although it is not written that he assures it, that Pelayo participated in the ill-named Battle of Guadalete, where the Muslim troops of Tariq ibn Sayyad defeated the army of Don Rodrigo, beginning the conquest of Visigothic Spain. We do not also know if he participated in the subsequent battles of Ecija and Emerita Augusta, today Merida. It is possible that in the last, if he participated, sheltered in the city, Queen Egilona, so the chronicles tell us Alpenses, Pelayo and his sister left Toledo ahead of the arrival of the Muslims, as all the nobles who did not join the Umayyad did. Some left to the Septimania, others to Galicia, some to the Pyrenees, and many to Asturias, as was the case of Pelayo. In 714, Uthman bin Isa, a Berber who had participated in the Battle of Guadalete, better known as Menuza, was appointed by the Caliphate Umayyad governor of Galicia, which today would be Galicia, Asturias, Cantabria, the north of Portugal and part of Castilla-Leon. Taking advantage of the Roman roads, Menuza sent a small garrison to Gijón to take possession of the lands of the Transmontana Astur. Being his military forces rather scarce, the governor, as was usual, preferred to agree with the lords of the area his submission in exchange for charges and preventions before starting a war of uncertain result. As the Albeldense Chronicle sets out, it is determined that Pelayo must have had some position of importance, probably a tax collector or the like. How did Pelayo cease to be the Muslims' friend and turn rebel? We don't know, for the diversity of chronicles and the contradictions between them leave wide scope for choice. One of them would be that Menuza would have become enamored of Hermesinda or Adesinda, though we cannot guarantee you her name, sister of Pelayo, and of whom she was also his tutor. The governor, in order that he might leave Pelayo separate from his sister, and thus be able to marry the woman he desired, had Alcantabro asked her sent to the capital of Al-Andalus, Córdoba, at the head of a committee with the tributes collected in Asturias. On his return, Pelayo found out the trick and was angered at having married his sister to an infidel, and that his honor had been besmirched by having promised, with a certain Don Alfonso, to marry Hermesinda to the latter. Pelayo, enraged, would have appeared at the wedding with the intention, for some of them he did, to excuse Menuza, but the governor's personal bodyguard did not, having no other alternative in Astur than to flee to save his life. There is another one, founded on the Arabic chronicles, which assures that Pelayo, by custom of the time, was taken to Córdoba along with other children of the prominent Asturians as a hostage to ensure capitulation. Pelayo escaped and was able to return, finding refuge among the Asturians. There are other versions and variations, but all agree in the same. Pelayo escapes and finds refuge in Europe's peaks. However, it is usual for researchers to tell much less beautiful stories than those narrated by literates, but they are usually more accurate. That is why the vast majority of historians, without completely digging up what the chronicles say, point out that Pelayo's day occurred due to more earthly matters. The Umayyad Caliphate had suffered a series of defeats in its clashes with the Byzantine Empire and with the First Bulgarian Empire, which had exhausted the caliphal arches. More needed to be gathered. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754 accounts that the Muslims copied the taxes. The Asturians would readily revolt, and the Umayyads would impose a stern repression on them, driving some men to the mountains where there were fine pastures for cattle and some villages. It was no less significant for this uprising the Umayyads wished to grant land to the Asturians among the Muslim troops that had fought in the so-called Battle of Guadalete. According to the Sebastianian Chronicle, Pelayo, an unruly donkey for the Muslim historian Ahmed Mohammed al-Makari, was selected as a guide by the insurgent donkeys, some 300 for the Algerian historian. These, with women and livestock, found refuge in Mount Uziba, close to Cangas de Onis, in the Dominican Cove, says the Rotense Chronicle, or in the sanctuary of Santa Maria, if we consider the Sebastianese, initiating the harassment with the help of the local population against Umayyad domination in the Transmontane Asturias. We do not know if in the spring of 722 or in that of 718, since the historians disagree. The Muslims, tired of persecuting the men of Pelayo, sent a detachment led by the great General Alcama to put an end to the rebellion's venture. In the committee, Bishop Opus traveled for some, son of the deceased Batiza, and brother for others. Anyway, one of the leaders of the faction Goda, against Don Rodrigo, who supported the Muslim entry into Hispania. Now, Alfonso III of Asturias chronicles are an over-the-top, exaggerated and sometimes fictionalized version, starting with the Muslim army, consisting of 187,000 men at arms. Information processed by the committee is scarce and confusing. Most likely, Pelayo and his men, acquaintances of the land, were retreating and harassing the Muslim army through the valleys and slopes of the peaks of Europe as it advanced, until they were taken to the narrowest part of the throat that closes Mount Uziba, where the Saracen army had no space to maneuver, losing value, its numerical superiority and organizational efficiency. It seems ruled out by a large number of historians that the battle would take place in the mythical Cova Dominica, today Santa Cueva de Covadonga, but in its vicinity. After an exchange of arrows, Pelayo and his men, from the cliffs that border the narrow valley of Cangas, with all kinds of weapons, including stones, annihilated the Ismailite vanguard troops. General Alcama was slain in this battle, and Opus was taken prisoner. The remaining Saracen host started a precipitate flight for fear of their lives. In a sorrowful march through the summits of Europe, persecuted at every step by the armies of Pelayo, on the banks of the Deva River, in the valley of Libana, near Cascala, a detachment, undoubtedly spurred on by the Asturians, interred the remainder of the Muslim host. In the battle, which a large part of historiography convicted in the foundational event of the Kingdom of Asturias, the first of all that would form in Spain in its day, it is not certain of the total number of men who participated. Archaeological findings allow us to deduce that the figure on both sides would not be greater than 2,000 men. Governor Munuza, who was in Gijón when he heard the news of Saracen defeat, for many he left the city with the rest of the Muslims who were still in the transmontane Asturias, heading to the plateau. Somewhere, up to the present day today, without naming the actual route of the port of La Mesa, he certainly perished, together with the rest of his troops, in an ambush of Pelayo's troops. The lack of garrisons or pastures enabled Pelayo to take complete control of the so-called nuclear Asturias, the central and eastern part of current Asturias. News of the triumph attracted Christian Asturias from other regions, including not a few Gothic knights who put themselves at the service of King Astor in his court of Canicas, the current Cangas de Onís. The choice for the location of this little town as the capital for the small and exposed Christian kingdom, instead of Gigia, the modern-day Gijón, the kingdom's largest city, was due to the safety provided by the tops of Europe in case of a hypothetical Muslim invasion. Pelayo would die in 737 in Cangas de Onís, after 19 years of reign, buried beside his wife, Queen Gaudiosa, who died a couple of years earlier, in the Santa Eulalia de Obamia church. Alfonso X the Wise moved the bones of Don Pelayo and his wife to the Santa Cueva de Covadonga, where they rest today. He was followed by his son Fávila, who might rule for only 2 years when he died beneath the tarps of the bear he had sought to slay. Alfonso, husband of Hermesinda, daughter of Don Pelayo and son of Pedro de Cantabria, one of the forgotten men of Spanish history, succeeded him to the throne and became Alfonso I of Asturias. The descendants of those 30 surviving wild asses of the Battle of Covadonga, as later entitled by Hamed Muhammad al-Makari, and who might do little harm to the great Mela army, slowly expanded their little kingdom. That modest triumph over time was amplified, surrounding it with legends, symbolism, and miraculous prodigies. But the contemporary Spain that we know, just like our history, would undoubtedly be quite different from not having won over more than 1,300 years ago, the hosts of Don Pelayo. Because as they say in Asturias, not with a little bit of reason, this is Spain, the rest is reconquered lawn.